this video, we're going to explore what we can do with Ableton Push 3's expressive MPE-enabled pads, starting at the foundations of how they work, creative examples of what they're capable of, and the various possibilities that have now opened up to us in terms of how we use them. This video is supported by those of you who've joined the Push Bible and Push Playground. Additionally, and in this special case, this video is sponsored by Ableton, but they have no say over what I'm sharing with you here. If you're watching this on YouTube, there are timestamps below if you'd like to jump to any particular section. There's much more video and content to come on both my channels on YouTube. Subscribe if you'd like to see more of those. There are three main aspects of MPE, aka MIDI polyphonic expression, that we're going to explore here. The first is note pitch bend, going sideways on the pads, slide, going vertically on the pads, and pressure, pushing in and out on the pads. Let's take a look at note pitch bend, which is essentially the ability to take any note and many at the same time and move them in terms of pitch up and down. When exploring note pitch bend for the first time, especially when you first get Push 3, it's definitely worth quite quickly going over to the settings just to try out a few different things, because they affect things a lot. So here on the settings button, on the second tab in expression, we have essentially three, or you could argue four parameters which are important. The first is MPE on or off. In this case, it is, but the next three are here. Note pitch bend, is it active or not? The in-tune location of where you land on the pad, and then the width of the tuning itself per pad. Let's look at the first one, whereby we can essentially turn note pitch bend off. Why would we want to do that? We might want to do it because we want to use other aspects of MPE, such as slide or pressure, but we don't want to have to worry or use the aspect of moving our fingers around on push in order to change pitch per note. So it's the same kind of playing experience you'd have on Push 2 or Push 1. Which again could be useful. This is also a different musical expression to this one. So the in-tune location option is very interesting. Essentially, it sets up whether the location of your finger on the pad is going to be what influences the pitch as you first play it, or is it just going to be that it doesn't matter where you land on the pad and you will just hear the same pitch no matter what. So in this case, it's set to finger, and it means that no matter where I play the pad, be it right on the edges or in the middle, it'll always be the same pitch. If I change this to pad, that means it will change the pitch according to where I land on the pad. So either slightly higher in pitch or slightly lower. So you can see it's a very, very different experience, and certainly relates a little bit to this idea of using push as a string instrument, because in a way, this pad setting is a little bit more like we'd be plucking a string and moving our finger to a different position, whereas this one, I don't really have an analogy for it except for the original way the push worked, in that it doesn't matter where you land on a pad, you'll always get the same pitch. In-tune width is obviously going to be very important, because what this essentially controls is how wide is the range of pitch adjustment on each pad. So if we make this very, very small, it means that if I just move a tiny bit to the right or left, it's already going to change the pitch. If I make it much wider, it's going to be really only at the edges that we hear that pitch bend. So again, that's a very personal choice, and I think it's really important to explore that and see what you might prefer. You might even indeed in the beginning choose to have it quite broad, or you might have it quite broad so that you can use the pad's location, but more often hit the right location. So these essentially talk to each other and are very important to try out in a few different ways. I've tended to keep mine somewhere around 10 or maybe 13, just because I'm still getting used to the fact that I can actually move my fingers around and do these kind of pitch bends. And in a way, I prefer to have the possibility of having my fingers move slightly out of position on the pad while I may be doing other things, also while moving other fingers, but not have the pitch being influenced too much. But then now and then, still have the ability to, without going too far, move into that other sort of pitch range of the note. Personally, the settings I quite like are to keep it on automatic, have the in-tune location to finger, in-tune width maybe 10 or 13 millimeters, and usually slide I'll have a little bit less than it's currently set to here. For those of you wondering which instrument I've used Ethereal Brushed Bells, which has a drift instance inside of it, and I've just edited it a little bit, including turning off slide using MPE Control so that I don't have to worry about that while I show you note pitch bend. What I'll also say, and I think is a really creative aspect and a kind of crossover of MPE note pitch bend and Push's ability to show certain scales, is that in the scale mode, we can now start choosing other layouts and looking at other things we might do. With those different setups, because they're going to allow us to do longer or shorter bends, essentially. Naturally, we could be in chromatic mode if you prefer, but what I have seen and heard some Push players say is that they used to indeed prefer to always be here because they could access all of the notes in or out of a key, but that now using in-key mode and, for example, a setting whereby the in-tune width is perhaps quite small and the in-tune location is set to pad, that means you can essentially still access all of the notes, but over a smaller area. Essentially, we've kind of zoomed out, whereas chromatic is kind of zooming in to one area, which again could be important because that's essentially talking about the resolution of the pads per note. So a very simple example is we're in C minor, we're in chromatic, and we can now access all of the notes in the scale as well as ones out of it, which of course are super critical for adding all kinds of musicality to things in various different situations. Now, for those of us like myself who are often in key mode, I can access the B from just sliding my finger down from the C. For some of us, being able to do that is not that important. For some of us, it's absolutely critical. What this means is that the scale and the layout of the scale and push has a really important, really interesting relationship to note pitch bend itself, and ultimately the creative kind of results we can get out of it. Now, what is interesting about both note pitch bend and slide and pressure is that they can be mapped to all kinds of other things in live, and we can go really deep and really crazy with that kind of stuff. I think it's best, however, in the case of note pitch bend, to start with a device which exists in all versions of Ableton Live, intro and upwards, where we can adjust the sensitivity, essentially, of note pitch bend and pressure and slide. This device we can find here by just going to the plus button, going to device, going through until we get to MIDI effects, and coming over to MIDI control. MIDI control, I'm just going to add the default version here, will allow us to essentially adjust the curve of a response for pressure, slide, and pitch. So in this case, we're working with pitch. So that's the normal setup for pitch. I can make it so that essentially it's going to move up the pitch range much more quickly if I turn this pitch value to a -1. You can do it even more extreme. You can do some really crazy things here. If we look over in Ableton Live, we just zoom in here and make sure that note pitch bend is selected, we can see that the control that we are using is this one here. So if I change it on push, of course it'll change in live as well. And you can see that this is the normal setup. And while the controls on push itself are relatively limited, we can press it once to step inside and just see a few more extra controls here, which are definitely worth exploring. I will, however, just give a quick example, which is that we can reverse the way that pitches work on push. Here you can see pitch min and pitch max. If we switch these around, instead of going up to the right, we're actually going to go down. Which is pretty wild when we start here. And it's essentially now playing a note higher up here. So if we release and now press again, it's playing the original note, which should in fact be there. Here I've dropped MPE Control with some rather extreme settings in front of a drift instance, and just take a listen to this. I mean, it's nuts. The sound design possibilities here, the possibility to come up with something otherworldly, as well as just add some gentle expression, are quite something. Okay, it's now time to look at slide, and this is just potentially one of my absolute favorite aspects of MPE on Push 3. I don't know about you, but I think that that is just wild. And this is just the tip of the iceberg of what we can do with slide. So when we're using slide, we obviously want to come to the settings. Here at the second tab of the little cog button will bring us there. And we have the parameter slide height. Here I can see that I can go from 10 up to 16 currently. I wouldn't be surprised if this also changes over time. And that essentially, again, defines the zone of how far we need to move our finger for slides to become active. So 10 millimeter, it's the most sensitive that we have currently. So I have this 10 millimeter zone out of which I can move and then activate slide. I can make this bigger so that slide effectively is less likely, or I have to really lean in to the pads to trigger. Another sound, just to give another example of that, perhaps the percussion. Now, what's also worth mentioning is that the settings of the actual instrument itself and anything which has been mapped via slide will also be relevant in terms of how much we hear slide when we move our finger up or down. That's a slightly more involved process, but we'll touch upon that in a moment. So I'd like to walk us through some of the sounds I used in the performance video XY, which you can see on my YouTube channel, because they were really interesting jumping off points for me to explore slide and MPE in general, but also to see where I could pick out certain aspects of a sound and add my own expression, my own connections between MPE parameters such as slide and effects. The first one here is MPE Cello. Now, when I saw the name, I winced because I often am very suspicious of anything which is going to try to emulate an analog instrument from the real world, such as a cello and in particular string instruments. However, I think this has a really nice balance of sounding string-like, but also being clearly synthetic. So this preset in question is called MPE Cello Bow in Ableton Live's library, again in 11.3. And what I did was I brought that in to a track and then opened the already present expression control parameter and started adding this to some other parameters. First, it's worth saying that there was already one applied, and that was slide in this case. You can see it's been applied to shimmer. Now, sometimes with these you have to dig a little bit to see what that actually is and where it is within the racks. You might need to open things up. And at the end here we can see hybrid reverb, where there is this parameter shimmer just here on the right. So that's been mapped, and if I use push or a slide movement on a pad, we can see that it's moving up and down the shimmer parameter there. But there's also some other things going on that you might have already noticed. And that is that I've hooked up slide to two of the sends, or two of the return, well, the send and return tracks, let's put it that way. So that, and if we look here, when I use a slide movement, it pushes the sound out to the sends or return tracks. So that means on certain notes I can pick them out somewhat. And it'll really only be those notes that get sent out to these additional reverbs. Coming to perc here, this sound I love very, very deeply and sounds like this. So essentially, kind of very low pitched tom-like sound, which goes on forever with a lot of bass content in it, where when I push my finger up, we get this wash of noise. So this sound is from Live's library originally. Here it's called Lo-Fi Tech Tom in the percussive area. Should be available on Live Intro 11.3 and upwards, as far as I know, because it's for drift sound. However, the one I've got here will be different from the one you load. If you load the one that's in the library, you'll get something which sounds like this. So rather different, it's important to say. My version, I've done a little bit of work to it to get it to sound a little bit more epic. Now, first off, we can see with expression control, I've done, again, something I've been doing before, connecting slide up to the different reverbs here and the sends and returns there, C and E. So if I slide up, you can see it pushes up the sends and returns there. However, that's not all. Let's just turn that off for now so it doesn't distract us too much. Now we can, of course, design everything within Ableton Live itself, but in this case, we can also use push. With drift, if we press on it, we can go to the custom modulation here once we've pressed on drift once to step inside it. And on custom mod, we can see these three slots. We have 1 set to slide, 2 set to envelope 1, let's leave it like it is. 3 is set to pressure. Let's just bring that down for now so it doesn't distract us. And come back to slot number 1. Now here it's set to 100% for the noise gain, so that sort of white noise we can hear. If I turn this to 0, we're not going to hear any adjustment in the noise oscillator while we move our finger. It's just basically always on. If we put this to 0, or minus 100, excuse me, we get the reverse of what we had before. If we turn the expression control device back on so that it's hooked up once again, slide to the sends and returns, we can then get what we had originally, which is the low hit, some noise, which then washes out some reverb and delay. So pressure in MPE land is another parameter we can play with. It's bearing in mind that it's actually very, very similar in how it ends up functioning to polyphonic aftertouch, which we have in push 1 and push 2, as long as you're on a new enough version of Live, in that we can now use the Z direction or Z direction to push down on the pads. This is me pushing down on the pad in order to get extra expression. So taking a look at some of these sounds which are linked up to pressure, this one here is called Ghost Edit, but it's actually called MPE Ghost Choir Pad. You should have this in all versions of Live 11.3 since it's based on drift. We can hear that it sounds like pushing into the pad is changing the cutoff frequency of the filter. If we want to go and see what's going on inside here, we can open up the instrument rack that contains everything, come to drift, press 1 time on it once again, come to custom mod, and then just look for the mod slot where this turns up. You can see number 2, pressure, is got 59% linked up to the low pass frequency. So if you turn this down to 0, it's going to be gone. Now, last but certainly not least is this one. Now, I've taken this Rogue sound again from Drift, a Drift instance, a Drift instrument, and yeah, it sounds like this, which is nuts. Now, if I press just very gently, it's going to be the same note always. As I push it down, I start to hear more random notes, more delay. As I release pressure, again, it's the same note and everything is flat without any effects. An awful lot of fun, like so much fun to play with this. You also get some very odd results sometimes if I press multiple notes, for example. There's also something I've done with the mapping somewhere, I think by accident, whereby you heard a moment ago, I just pressed early on in the second series of notes, and this kind of little wiggle came, and I don't even know why that is yet. And this is kind of what happens when you're getting into MPE sound design. There's a lot of unexpected, sometimes happy or less happy accidents. There's a lot to talk about here. I want to try and keep this relatively simple and just talk about what's going on with pressure. So what we have is pressure being applied to chants. and chance is being increased. So this is a random device, a random MIDI note generating device, which you have in every version of Ableton Live. And I've just hooked that up with the expression control device here. So if we look, we can see we've got aftertouch, aftertouch, aftertouch. Now, aftertouch is essentially the same as pressure. And so we're going to just say it's the same, even though what I find interesting is it doesn't get listed separately as pressure here. I'm not sure why that is. I literally don't know. What I can tell you is aftertouch, i.e. polyphonic aftertouch, is very similar in what it can do to pressure, and that they are just a little bit different how they work technically, but musically, and I think that's what matters here, they essentially allow us to do the same thing. So aftertouch, in this case, has been applied to delay shift, it's been applied to chance, it's been applied to the bass of the scale here, and yeah, it's just very, very interesting result. So of course, I should just highlight that as I press it, you can see things moving here on the sends and returns. Now there are also things in terms of slides that have been applied here, and so on and so forth. So it's a relatively complex patch, but the result is just a lot of fun. So again, very little pressure right now. A little bit of pressure on the top note. And take it off again. I mean, it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. So as I hope it's already clear by now, there's an awful lot to talk about here in terms of using note pitch bend, using slide, using pressure, little gestures to help in case we forgot what they were. And there's still one more thing to talk about. There's a few more things to talk about in terms of expression, but one in particular, and that is percussion, and something very exciting indeed. So here I've loaded the MPE Analog Kit. This is in the core library, so you shouldn't need anything special as long as you've got Live 11.3. So just a note, I've put the accent on so that everything's going to be the same velocity, so that won't affect what we're hearing. What affects what we're going to hear here is my position on the pad, vertically speaking. That is just ridiculously cool. So as I go up, you can hear big changes in the nature of the sound. If we take another one from the library, the core library here, we can take the MPE Synth Lab Kit and drop that in here. Let's take a listen to this. Now that's just the start of what we can do with these MPE-enabled drum kits. They are super, super interesting. Now, if you're looking for more MPE-enabled drum kits, there are 2 new packs that Ableton has released. Now, I thought I would just check the pack's website to give you the most up-to-date information, and I see that it says included with Push 3. As always, check the description of this video should there be any changes to that. They work with Live 11.3 intro and up, and there are a whole bunch of them. Here's Session Drums Club with a whole series in there, and Session Drums Studio here. Now, a whole bunch of things to explore here. So let's just load this up. So what does this one sound like? That's nice. Also really nice. That one I don't hear much going on. That's cool. It's as if we got some extra pads in there basically within the same space. This is something which I think probably you'll agree has a lot of potential. So I am also making some short videos, very short videos called MPE Video Diaries, which I'm sharing on the workshop channel on YouTube. If you want to check those out, there's no talking, it's just musical exploration of what we can do with MPE, some of the sounds in Ableton Live that are new, and also some sound design. Now, there is just so much more to talk about with MPE, and I'm continually surprised by the stuff I keep discovering, even just while making this video. It is a really, really just interesting place to go. And what I think it has done is it has taken this grid and added so much dimensionality to it, where before it was, of course, a grid of pads with notes up on it, and we could indeed press in using polyphonic aftertouch. Now, essentially, every pad has become its own little landscape. So in a way, a sort of hilly terrain of creativity. Now, that might not be the best metaphor, but I quite like it. Even though the grid stays flat, we can really sort of dig in there and do all kinds of things. And it is just an awful lot of fun to explore. There remains, of course, one question. Can we turn ourselves into MPE? So that was a look at MPE and Push 3, a kind of broad strokes, abstract painting of the different kind of places we can go with it, together with some slightly more detailed looks at what's possible here and there. For me, it's really clear that the addition of MPE adds these extra layers and dimensions of, well, creative territory that we can explore with Push 3. It's just really, really clear to me. And while I found it initially a little bit intimidating, particularly note pitch bending and that kind of new technique where I thought, this is awkward. Can I even do this that well? I've now quickly gotten used to it and really starting to enjoy it, especially after exploring the range of the settings that we have on Push, as well as some of the devices we can use or alterations we can make to sounds that are MPE enabled. So as always, there is just so much to talk about. I'll be doing so in great depth and detail in the Push Bible courses, both broadly and in detail, such as sound design. Check the links below. I'd like to thank Ableton for supporting this video. Subscribe if you'd like to see more, and take care.